You've heard of Stuxnet. Maybe you've read an article, or caught a 5-minute summary somewhere. But the full story, every move, every person, every decision, deserves more than that. We're giving it 44 minutes. Let's start from the beginning. Act 1. Deep underground, a mystery spreads. Natanz, Iran. Standing on the surface, you'd see nothing. No towering smokestacks, no roaring machinery. Just a flat stretch of desert, where the wind occasionally stirs pale yellow dust across an empty plain. But 8 meters below ground, beyond walls of reinforced concrete, nearly 3 feet thick, another world exists entirely. Down there lies a vast underground factory, its floor space stretching across the equivalent of dozens of football fields, laid side by side. At its heart stand rows of metal columns, lined up in perfect formation. Centrifuges, thousands of them, each one connected to the next through a labyrinth of pipes, silent and disciplined as an army at attention. Every single one spinning without pause, at speeds the human eye could never follow. More than 60,000 rotations per minute. This is uranium enrichment. Uranium hexafluoride gas is pumped through the pipes and into the hollow cores of these spinning machines. Under enormous centrifugal force, the heavier uranium-238 atoms are flung to the outer walls, while the lighter uranium-235 atoms concentrate at the center. Stage by stage, the uranium is refined. Batch by batch, it grows more concentrated. The process is painstaking and precise. It demands thousands of machines running in unison and takes months, sometimes years, to complete. Enriched uranium is the fuel of nuclear power plants. It is also the core ingredient of the most destructive weapon mankind has ever built. In the autumn of 2009, the engineers here began to feel uneasy. There was no dramatic warning sign, only this: centrifuges were breaking down a little more often than usual. The control panels showed everything normal: pressure stable, rotation stable, temperature stable. Yet those expensive, finely calibrated machines were failing, one by one, silently. Some showed worn bearings, others had cracked rotors. A few simply came apart, mid-operation, as though surrendering to some invisible, relentless force. The engineers checked the equipment. They checked the suppliers. They reviewed every operational procedure. They found nothing. They were baffled. This facility was completely air-gapped. In cybersecurity terms, that means physically disconnected from the internet, with no external network links of any kind. No wireless signal could enter. Every person and every object that crossed the perimeter was subject to multiple layers of security screening. By every measure, this should have been one of the safest places on Earth. No one knew the answer had already been hiding inside the system for over a year. No one knew that a silent war had already begun. Act 2. A Saturday in Belarus. June 2010. Minsk, Belarus. Sergei Ulysin was the team leader at a small cybersecurity company called Virus Blockader. The firm was modest in size, modest in reputation, the kind of place that barely registered in the shadow of the industry's big names. It was a Saturday. Ulysin wasn't at his desk. He was attending a friend's wedding, roughly 400 kilometers from Minsk. The celebration had spilled outdoors into a forest, and the guests were drinking, dancing, moving through the dappled sunlight between the trees. Then, his phone rang. The caller was their partner in Iran, a friend he'd known for years, someone he trusted. The partner's client was having trouble. A batch of computers kept crashing and rebooting. The technical support team had been at it for hours and gotten nowhere. Could Ulysses take a look? So there he stood, at the edge of a wedding celebration in the woods, surrounded by guests in their finest clothes. The sound of clinking glasses and laughter drifting through the air, while he pressed a phone to his ear and spoke in some strange language about operating system crashes and driver conflicts. He would later recall that the guests stared at him like he was some kind of apparition, utterly unable to figure out what this man was doing. That evening, they made no progress. They agreed to pick it up again on Monday. Monday came. Olesen remotely connected to the malfunctioning computer in Iran and began working through it methodically, eliminating possible software conflicts one by one until something strange caught his eye. He had found a virus. But this was no ordinary virus. Ulysses had spent years in the security industry. He had seen all kinds of malicious software, from amateur scripts thrown together by hobbyists to sophisticated toolkits built by professional criminal organizations. But he had never seen anything like this. The program was breathtakingly complex. Its code architecture was tight and layered. Its functions nested within functions, built with the precision of a carefully engineered structure. Not something cobbled together, but something designed. And then, there was something even stranger. It carried a legitimate digital signature. A digital signature is the identity document of the software world. Every time a program tries to run at the system level, the operating system checks its signature. Only certified, trusted software is allowed in. This virus's driver file carried a genuine signature from Realtek Semiconductor, a publicly listed Taiwanese company with an impeccable reputation, which meant something extraordinary. It meant that someone, somehow, had obtained that company's private signing key. The more Ulysses and his colleagues dug, the more unsettled they became. They pulled the team together and began analyzing around the clock, arguing, drawing diagrams, tearing them apart, and starting over. With every step deeper into the code, one conclusion grew harder and harder to escape. This was not the work of ordinary hackers. Behind this thing was a team of considerable scale, considerable funding, and world-class technical capability. They first notified Microsoft. No response. 2 weeks later, they went public. On July 12, 2010, Ulysses posted a warning in an English-language security forum, publishing their findings and giving this unknown threat a name to file names buried deep in the malicious code. Stub and mrxnet.sys fused together into the name that would shake the entire cybersecurity world: Stuxnet. Act 3. Anatomy of a monster. Once the warning was out, the world's top security research teams descended. Symantec, Kaspersky, ESOT, dozens of independent researchers. They tore the program apart, piece by piece. It took months before they could finally assemble a complete picture of what they were looking at. And with every layer they peeled back, the shock deepened. First, the size. Stuxnet's main file was approximately 600 kilobytes, a staggering figure for a computer worm. For comparison, Configure, The worm that infected an estimated 6 million computers worldwide in 2008 was only 35 kilobytes. Stuxnet was nearly 20 times larger. A file that size meant it was doing many things, and doing them with extraordinary complexity. Then, the vulnerabilities. In cybersecurity, a zero-day vulnerability is the most precious resource there is. A zero-day is a flaw in software that has not yet been discovered, not yet reported, not yet patched. Once an attacker has won, they can breach even fully updated, fully protected systems without leaving a trace. These vulnerabilities command enormous prices on underground markets. A single top-tier, zero-day, can sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. A sophisticated hacker group launching a major operation might use one zero-day. That alone signals serious capability. Stuxnet used for previously unknown Windows zero-day vulnerabilities, each one targeting a different layer of the system. Propagation, privilege escalation, concealment, working in concert, flowing seamlessly into one another. When researchers first counted them, they nearly convinced themselves they'd made an error. The first vulnerability lived in the way Windows handled shortcut files, the .lnk format. The moment a user plugged in a Stuxnet-infected USB drive, they didn't need to open a single file. The virus executed automatically the instant the file browser displayed the drive's contents. It was like glancing at a suitcase with a bomb inside and having it detonate from the act of looking. The second vulnerability was hidden in Windows Print Spooler service, allowing the worm to move laterally, quietly, through local networks. The third targeted a remote code execution flaw in Windows Server, a vulnerability that had technically been discovered and patched 2 years earlier. But Stuxnet kept exploiting it, because, in industrial environments, computers rarely get updated. The fourth let the virus escalate its own system privileges, giving it the highest possible level of control over any machine it infected. For 0 days, for master keys, enough to open almost any door. And then, there was the matter of the digital signatures. Researchers kept digging, and found that beyond real-text certificate, Stuxnet had also used a genuine signature from a second Taiwanese company, J-Micron. The headquarters of the two companies were in the same building, separated by only a few hundred meters. This wasn't something achievable through a remote network attack. Someone had physically walked into those offices and stolen the private signing keys. Then the researchers made the discovery that was perhaps the most unsettling of all. Stuxnet, for all its terrifying complexity, was almost completely non-destructive. Out of the 100,000 plus computers it had infected, Stuxnet had done absolutely nothing to the vast majority of them. It moved silently, spread quietly, like a person who had slipped into a crowd, but was looking for only one specific face. When Stuxnet entered a machine, it ran a check. Does this computer have Siemens Step 7 software? Installed the programming environment used for industrial control systems? If not, keep spreading. Keep waiting. If yes, run another check. Is this machine connected to a Siemens S7 to 315 or S7 to 417 programmable logic controller? If not, keep waiting. If yes, run one more check. Are the frequency converters connected to this PLC made by Vaken in Finland or Ferraro Paya in Tehran? And are there at least 33 of them? Only when every single condition was satisfied, only then, did Stuxnet reveal its true purpose. This was Stuxnet's most astonishing quality. It wasn't wanton destruction. It had a precise target map, with exactly one location marked on it. Act 4. The perfect lie. The moment Stuxnet confirmed it had found its target, it activated its carefully engineered attack sequence. And that attack sequence was, in its own way, a work of art, a masterpiece of deception. First, it spent several weeks simply watching, observing, recording the system's normal operational state, the standard rotation speeds, the standard pressure readings, the standard sensor values. It stored all of those normal figures carefully. It would need them later. The IR-1 centrifuge operates at a nominal working frequency of between 807 and 1210 Hz, roughly 63,000 rotations per minute. This range was the product of careful engineering, fast enough to effectively separate uranium isotopes, but not so fast that the aluminum rotors would tear themselves apart under centrifugal stress. That critical threshold was written precisely into Stuxnet's code. Then the attack began. Stuxnet quietly modified the PLC's control logic and issued a new command to the frequency converters. Push the centrifuge speed up to 1410 Hz. Hold it there for approximately 15 minutes, 1410 Hz. At that frequency, the tangential wall speed of the IR-1's aluminum rotor reached 443 meters per second, approaching the physical limits of what that material could endure. The rotor bent and vibrated under forces it was never designed to withstand, burning through its own structural integrity with every passing second. After 15 minutes, Stuxnet released its grip. It let the centrifuges return to normal, then went silent, completely silent, for 27 days. It waited patiently, while the engineers convinced themselves that whatever had happened, it was over now. Everything was fine again. 27 days later, it struck again, this time in the opposite direction. It drove the frequency crashing down to 2 Hz. From thousands of rotations per second to a near total standstill. Imagine a car traveling at highway speed and having the brakes slammed without warning. The violent deceleration sent shockwaves of mechanical stress through the bearings and rotors. Accelerate, stop, accelerate, stop, cycle after cycle. Relentless and invisible. And here is the part that makes your blood run cold. Throughout every second of this attack, what did the operator's control screens show? Everything normal. While Stuxnet sabotaged the centrifuges, it simultaneously fed the monitoring system. The normal readings it had recorded during its weeks of silent observation. The operators sat at their consoles, looking at steady pressure curves, ordinary rotation readings, green status indicators, and had no idea whatsoever what was happening to the machines a few hundred meters away. They watched what appeared to be normal operations, while just down the corridor, those centrifuges were quietly, relentlessly destroying themselves. This was Stuxnet's most brilliant design principle. Its goal was never immediate destruction. Its goal was to trap an entire facility in a fog of inexplicable malfunction, forcing engineers into cycles of checking and rechecking, doubting their own instruments, doubting their own competence, to make the Iranians believe the problem was material quality or operator error, or that their engineers simply weren't skilled enough. rather than that they had been attacked. One machine fails early. Call it a quality issue. 2. Call it human error. 10. 100. Until the losses become impossible to explain, and the precious time has already been lost forever. This wasn't just a technical attack. It was a psychological dismantling. Act 5. WHY, Iran. To understand why Stuxnet exists, you have to first understand the history that made it necessary. Go back to 2002. That year, an Iranian opposition group held a press conference in Washington and announced something that stunned the world. Iran had secretly constructed 2 nuclear facilities, one at Natanz, one at Arak, and had never disclosed either one to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968, any nation pursuing nuclear capabilities is required to submit to IAEA monitoring and inspection. Iran's concealment sent shockwaves through the international community. The IAEA dispatched an investigation team to Natanz when they collected environmental samples and sent them back to the laboratory. The results made everyone freeze. The samples contained traces of highly enriched uranium, a grade of material with no plausible civilian purpose. Iran's official explanation never changed. These facilities were for peaceful energy production. Nuclear power, nothing more. Very few believed it. For Israel, this was an existential threat. Israel's entire territory covers barely 20,000 square kilometers. A country small enough that a single nuclear weapon could effectively erase it from the map. For decades, Iranian state media and political leaders had maintained a posture of open hostility toward Israel. Iran funded Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran's leadership had publicly designated Israel an enemy. A nuclear-armed Iran wasn't just a strategic concern for Israel. It was a question of survival for the United States. The situation was equally volatile. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the relationship between Washington and Tehran had been defined by deep mutual hostility. The American hostage crisis, decades of sanctions and confrontation. A nuclear Iran would fundamentally alter the balance of power across the entire Middle East. Military strikes were on the table, but Natanz sat 8 meters underground, protected by massive concrete. Iran's air defense systems were not to be underestimated. And beyond the practical difficulties, an airstrike meant a public declaration of war, meant setting the entire region ablaze with consequences no one could predict. Diplomatic pressure had been tried for years. Sanctions, negotiations, UN resolutions, round after round, while Iran's centrifuge count kept climbing. There had to be another way. In 2006, President George W. Bush received a classified briefing at the White House. The CIA had conceived something unprecedented. Attack machines with code. Destroy hardware with software. Cripple Iran's nuclear capability without firing a single shot. The operation had a name. Operation Olympic Games. Act 6. The Dutchman. The weapon existed, but there was a fatal obstacle. Natanz's core systems were air-gapped, physically disconnected from the internet, with no channel of access through any network. You couldn't send Stuxnet in through a wire, any more than you could mail a letter into a building. With no mailbox and no door slot, someone had to physically carry it inside. This was the most dangerous and most dramatic part of the entire operation. The CIA turned to the AIVD, the Dutch General Intelligence and Security Service, for help. They needed someone who could gain legitimate access to the Natan's facility, someone with a technical background, the ability to move freely in Iran, and enough credibility to earn the trust of those inside. They found Eric van Sabin. Van Sabin was Dutch, born in 1972, a civil engineer by training. By the mid-2000s, he was based in Dubai, working for a company that transported industrial equipment, including shipments, into Iran. He was married to an Iranian woman. He traveled to Iran regularly. He knew the business environment. He had reasons to be there that raised no suspicion. He was perfect. The AIVD recruited him around 2005. Over the following 2 years, he methodically developed business relationships with contractors connected to the Natanz facility. His company was already part of the supply chain, feeding Iran's nuclear program. They shipped industrial equipment, including water pumps. In 2007, Eric van Sabin walked into Natanz. He walked through security as an ordinary engineer, carrying equipment to be installed, and descended into that underground factory buried beneath the Iranian desert. According to subsequent investigations, Stuxnet was embedded in the water pump equipment he installed. The moment that equipment was connected to Natanz's internal network, the virus began spreading silently through the air-gapped system, moving from machine to machine, searching. Dutch investigative journalists spent 2 years reconstructing this story, interviewing 43 people, including 19 employees of the Dutch intelligence services. When they reached former CIA Director Michael Hayden and asked him directly, he acknowledged that he remembered the operation, but said he couldn't say more than that. The details that emerged were, in their own way, troubling. The Dutch intelligence service had known they were helping to sabotage Iran's nuclear program, but they did not know what their agent was actually carrying inside. One Dutch intelligence source told the journalists, simply, "The Americans used us." As for the Dutch government itself, the sitting cabinet knew nothing. And as for Eric van Sabin, after completing his mission, he returned to Dubai. 2 years later, in January 2009, he was involved in a motorcycle accident there. He was 36 years old. His family said that in the period when the Stuxnet attack was unfolding, he had seemed to be gripped by some kind of panic. There was no evidence of foul play, but no one will ever know what he knew in his final days, or what he was carrying. Act 7. 3 evolutions. 1. Accident. Stuxnet was not created all at once. Like a living thing, it evolved over the course of the operation. Security researchers later confirmed that the worm went through at least 3 major versions. The earliest traces go back to around 2005, far earlier than the outside world had assumed. That first iteration was comparatively simple, with limited functionality, more reconnaissance tool than weapon. It didn't yet deploy those for zero-day vulnerabilities. Its methods of propagation were more restrained. It was learning before it struck. In June 2009, the first heavily documented and destructive version appeared, the one that began its assault on the centrifuges. Through 2010, the operation continued to escalate. Updates deployed in March, and then again in April of that year, produced a faster, more aggressive variant, with a more sophisticated attack, logic, and greater destructive impact. Symantec's research team, working through more than 2,000 collected Stuxnet samples, traced the earliest infections back to 2009. The 5 original patient zeros, the first companies the worm entered before beginning its approach to Natanz, were all Iranian firms specializing in industrial control systems. These companies were the stepping stones, the bridges across which Stuxnet made its patient approach toward the facility's internal network. The full operation, from early development to active deployment, consumed years of effort and dozens of elite engineers. Estimated cost: $1 to $2 billion. To verify that the attack code would actually work, American intelligence built a full-scale replica of the Natanz facility, deep in the forests of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Equipped with genuine IR-1 centrifuges, the attack sequence had to be tested against real hardware before anyone could be confident the code was right. That testing process alone took years. Then, in 2010, something went wrong. No one had planned for Stuxnet to leave Natanz, but a Natanz engineer had been using a personal laptop inside the facility. That laptop was infected. At some point after leaving the facility, he connected it to the internet and something in Stuxnet's code failed. It didn't correctly identify that it had crossed the perimeter into the outside world. The virus began to spread. From Iran, it moved through supply chains and business relationships, riding USB drives from machine to machine around the planet. It eventually infected computers in more than 100 countries, more than 100,000 machines in total. India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Malaysia, Australia, countries across Europe, the United States. Stuxnet's fingerprints were everywhere. That global outbreak destroyed any hope of keeping the operation secret. Act 8. The world starts to understand. As security researchers around the world obtained samples and began analyzing, a consensus formed quickly. This could not be the work of ordinary hackers. The complexity, the resources, the surgical precision of the targeting. There was only one explanation that fit. This was the work of a nation-state. Which nation? The answer was obvious to anyone paying attention. But no one dared say it plainly. Inside Stuxnet's code, researchers found details that seemed almost like deliberately planted clues. In an early version of the code, there was a veritable named Myrtus, the myrtle plant, whose name in Hebrew forms the root of the name Esther. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Esther tells the story of a Jewish people who strike preemptively, destroying their enemies before those enemies can attack. In the context of Israeli political culture, that reference carries unmistakable weight. Of course, it might have been coincidence, or it might have been deliberate misdirection. There was also a number buried in the code: 19,790,509. Researchers guessed it was a date: May 9th, 1979. On that day, Iranian Jewish businessman Habib El-Ghanian was executed by the Islamic Revolutionary Government, becoming the first Jewish person to be put to death after the revolution. Coincidence or intention? No one could say for certain. In 2012, New York Times journalist David Sanger published his investigative book, Confront and Conceal. It laid out in detail how Operation Olympic Games had been launched under President George W. Bush and continued under President Barack Obama, who personally authorized further attacks, even after Stuxnet had accidentally spread beyond Natanz. That same year, four-star U.S. General James Cartwright was identified as the source who had leaked classified details of the operation to the Times. He would later face legal proceedings, but the United States government has never officially admitted its involvement. Neither has Israel. At the official level, there is no perpetrator, no confession, no record. Only the code itself, quietly etched into history. Act 9. Measuring the damage. How much damage did it actually cause? That question remains genuinely contested. The most widely cited figure, approximately 1,000 centrifuges at Natanz, were damaged or destroyed by Stuxnet's attack. Roughly 1/5 of the facility's total complement at the time. IAEA inspection reports show that between 2009 and 2010, the number of operational centrifuges in Iran declined noticeably. Machines that should have been running continuously simply stopped, with no apparent explanation. Estimates of how far back Iran's nuclear program was set differ widely. Optimistic assessments say 1 to 2 years. More skeptical analysts believe Iran recovered faster than expected, and that the real-world impact was considerably more limited. A third interpretation has also been proposed. Perhaps destruction was never the primary goal. Perhaps Stuxnet's true purpose was to manufacture persistent, inexplicable malfunction, to erode the confidence of Iran's engineers in their own ability, to drain their time and attention into endless troubleshooting, to grind down an entire program's momentum through a fog of quiet, baffling failures. A more sophisticated form of damage, one that didn't just attack machines, but attacked morale, attacked time itself. Iran's president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, eventually acknowledged publicly that their nuclear facilities' computer systems had been targeted by a cyberattack. He claimed that Iranian experts had identified the problem and contained it, and that the impact on the nuclear program had been minimal. Very few believed that, either. Act 10. Pandora's Box. The accidental release of Stuxnet into the world produced consequences its creators had not anticipated. When this precision weapon was exposed in its raw form, its source code open to examination by every security researcher on the planet, everyone studied it. Not just defenders. Attackers, too. In the years that followed, a succession of similarly sophisticated cyber weapons were discovered. Duke, found in 2011, had a code architecture strikingly similar to Stuxnet's, but it didn't destroy. It stole. It specialized in extracting design documents and technical files from industrial control systems, as though preparing reconnaissance for a future strike. Flame, discovered by Kaspersky in 2012, was one of the most complex pieces of espionage software ever documented. At 20 megabytes in size, it could capture screenshots, record audio, hijack Bluetooth connections, activate microphones, and propagate through local networks. Analysts estimated it had been in development for 5 years or more. Gauss, also found in 2012, was targeted at the Lebanese banking system, built specifically to track the flow of funds toward Hezbollah. These 3 programs were attributed by researchers to a shadowy entity called the Equation Group, widely believed to be the most technically advanced, state-sponsored hacking operation ever identified. Almost certainly connected to the United States National Security Agency. Stuxnet was the first publicly exposed, globally dissected specimen this group had ever left behind. And it taught every hacker on Earth something that had never been demonstrated before. Code can destroy real machines in the real world. That door was closed before Stuxnet. Stuxnet opened it, and it has never been closed since. Act 11, 2021, History Echoes. April 11th, 2021. The Natanz nuclear facility suffered a massive power outage. The timing was difficult to overlook. It happened on the precise day that US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was meeting with senior Israeli officials. Iranian authorities called it an act of nuclear terrorism and pointed directly at Israel. Anonymous intelligence sources, quoted in Israeli media, quietly confirmed Israel's involvement. The reported attack method was digital, targeting the facility's power supply systems and triggering a sudden loss of electricity. Centrifuges, running at full speed, were subjected to the violent shock of an instant power failure. 10 years had passed. The weapons had changed form. The logic of the attacker and the identity of the target had not. And according to US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, speaking publicly in 2024, Iran is now reportedly just 1 to 2 weeks away from possessing enough enriched uranium to build a nuclear weapon. All of the damage, Stuxnet, the 2021 blackout, everything in between. However many years, however many months it may have bought, the program itself never stopped. Epilogue, the first digital bomb. In 2010, when a Belarusian engineer named Sergei Ulysin picked up his phone at the edge of a wedding celebration in the woods, he had no idea he was standing at the entrance to history. When his team spent months pulling that code apart, line by line, layer by layer, what they felt wasn't triumph. It was something deeper. A kind of awe, tinged with dread, that they couldn't quite name. Because what they were looking at wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a new logic of war. Before Stuxnet, an invisible boundary separated the physical world from the digital world. Code was code. Machines were machines. War was war. Hackers were hackers. These were different categories of reality, and they stayed in their lanes. Stuxnet dissolved that boundary. It told the world, wherever a control system connects to a network, a nuclear plant, a water treatment facility, a power grid, a hospital, a transportation system, that place is a potential battlefield. No explosion, no smoke, no soldiers. No party has officially admitted responsibility. No declaration of war was issued. No historical archive has been formally opened. But between 2009 and 2010, a real war was fought. The weapon was called Stuxnet. Its makers were a nation, or perhaps two nations, that still deny their involvement to this day. Its victims were 1,000 centrifuges that failed quietly. And the Iranian engineers who stood before their screens, staring at readouts that said everything was normal, while nothing was. And one more victim, a 36-year-old Dutch engineer who completed the most dangerous mission of his life, and then rode his motorcycle into the Dubai night and did not come back. History will leave none of them a formal footnote. But the code itself is the most honest testimony that remains.